At my husband's glamorous CEO dinner, his ambitious vice president called me a nobody in front of everyone, and he just let it happen. They thought I was just a quiet, retired wife living off his success. So I made one phone call and set up an 8 a.m. board meeting they would never forget. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The ballroom was a galaxy of artificial stars, with chandeliers dripping light onto tables laden with crystal and silver. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted duck, was a familiar symphony of corporate success I had learned to endure. For 25 years, I had played the part of Harper Thorne, the supportive wife of Marcus Thorne, the brilliant CEO of Apex Innovations. Tonight was the annual Innovators Gala, the pinnacle of his professional year, where he would receive the CEO of the Decade award. And I, as always, was his silent, smiling accessory. But tonight, the performance felt different. A strange exhaustion had settled deep in my bones over the past few months, a weariness that had nothing to do with late nights or social obligations. My doctor had given it a name last week, a severe autoimmune disorder. Nothing life-threatening, he'd assured me, but it demanded rest, quiet, and a significant reduction in stress. He looked at me over his spectacles, his expression kind but firm. "Your body is sending you a message, Harper. It's time to listen." I hadn't told Marcus yet. I was waiting for the right moment, a calm evening after the gala when the whirlwind of his work had settled. I wanted his full attention, his support. I needed it. We were seated at the head table, a long, imposing stretch of white linen populated by the Apex board members and their spouses. To Marcus's right sat Isabelle Laurent, the company's ferociously ambitious vice president of strategic partnerships. At 29, she was all sharp angles and sharper ambition, her crimson dress a slash of color against the sea of black tuxedos. She hung on Marcus's every word, her laughter a little too loud, her hand brushing his arm a little too often. I had noticed it before, but tonight, under the glare of the chandeliers, it felt less like admiration and more like an audition. The conversation turned to a recent, aggressive acquisition Apex had made. "It was a bold move, Marcus," said one of the board members, a portly man named George. "Risky, but brilliant." Marcus preened, adjusting his tie. "You have to take risks to stay on top. Apex doesn't follow the market, we create it." Isabelle jumped in, her voice smooth and practiced. "Marcus has a vision no one else possesses. He can see 5 steps ahead of everyone." She turned her brilliant smile on me, though it never quite reached her eyes. "You must be so proud, Harper. It must be wonderful, having the freedom to pursue your little hobbies while Marcus builds an empire." The words hung in the air, coated in a cloying sweetness that did little to hide their condescending sting. Little hobbies. She was referring to my work with art restoration charities and the quiet life I led. I managed a polite smile. "I enjoy my work, yes, and I've always been proud of Marcus." Isabelle's smile widened, a predator sensing a weakness. "Of course, it takes a certain kind of woman to stand behind a great man, someone content to manage the home front, to be a quiet partner. It's so traditional, almost quaint." I felt a prickle of unease. This was more than just youthful arrogance. This was a calculated barb. I looked at Marcus, expecting him to interject, to gently steer the conversation back to business or at least defend the life we had built together. He did nothing. He simply sipped his wine, a faint, indulgent smile on his face, as if he were enjoying the show. It was a small betrayal, but it landed like a physical blow. Later, as the dessert plates were being cleared, Marcus was pulled away by the event organizer to prepare for his speech. I was left at the table with Isabelle and a few others. The moment he was out of earshot, Isabelle leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant for everyone at the table to hear. "You know," she began, swirling the dregs of her champagne, "I always wondered what it was like for women of your generation. To have no real identity of your own. Your entire life is just a reflection of your husband's success." She looked directly at me, her eyes glinting. "I mean, what do you even do all day?" A hush fell over our end of the table. George's wife shot me a look of pure pity. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a direct, brutal assault, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who was absolutely certain of her own superiority. "Isabel, that's hardly a probe." "Riot," another board member's wife murmured, but Isabel waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm just curious. It's a sociological observation. Some women build empires and others, well, others marry them." She then delivered the final, devastating line, looking me up and down as if I were a piece of antique furniture. "No offense, Harper, but in a room full of innovators and leaders, you're essentially a nobody, just Mrs. Marcus Thorne." The word nobody echoed in the sudden silence. It was a brand, a judgment, a dismissal of my entire existence. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the table, my gaze landing on Marcus, who had just returned and had heard the last part of Isabel's pronouncement. I waited, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, for him to defend me. For him to shut her down with a sharp word, to put this arrogant young woman in her place, to stand by the woman who had been by his side for a quarter of a century. He met my desperate gaze, and in his eyes I saw not anger, not loyalty, not love, but a flicker of something that looked horrifyingly like agreement. He gave a small, non-committal shrug and offered Isabel a tight, approving smile. "Isabel is just passionate about the company, darling," he said, his tone placating, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "She sees everyone through the lens of their contribution." The implication was clear. I had made no contribution. I was nothing. The room began to spin. The glittering lights, the clinking glasses, the hum of self-important conversations, it all faded into a nauseating blur. The exhaustion I'd been fighting for months crashed over me in a tidal wave, mixed with a cold, sharp-edged grief. He had not only allowed them to humiliate me, he had validated it. He had looked at his wife of 25 years and in that single, silent moment, agreed that she was a nobody. The physical illness that had been slowly creeping up on me felt insignificant now. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. I don't remember the exact moment I stood up. My body seemed to move of its own accord, a puppet whose strings had finally been cut. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate, a small, absurd act of composure in the midst of my world shattering. "Excuse me," I murmured to no one in particular. "I'm not feeling well." Marcus started to rise, a flicker of performative concern crossing his face. "Harper, what is it?" "Just tired," I said, my voice as brittle as thin ice. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. If I saw that placid, dismissive expression again, I was afraid of what I might do or say. I walked away from the table, my steps measured and even. I could feel Isabel's smug gaze on my back, a physical weight of triumph. She had won. She had exposed me as irrelevant, and my husband had co-signed her verdict. The valet brought my car around, and I slid into the driver's seat, my hands trembling so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and street lamps smearing across my vision. By the time I walked into the cold, silent expanse of our house, my house, the shock had begun to recede, leaving behind a pain so profound it felt like a physical ache in my chest. For 25 years, I had meticulously built a wall between my two lives. On one side was Harper Thorne, the quiet, unassuming art historian. On the other was HT, the anonymous, decisive founder of HT Capital, a private holding company I had created with the inheritance my grandfather, a shrewd shipping magnate, had left me. He had taught me about business, about the art of the deal, and most importantly, about the power of staying in the shadows. "Let them underestimate you, Harper," he used to say. "It's the greatest advantage you'll ever have." I had founded HT Capital with a singular vision: to invest in promising but struggling companies, nurture them, and let them grow. Apex Innovations had been one of my earliest acquisitions. I saw potential not in the failing company it was, but in the ambitious young executive I had just married. Marcus was brilliant, driven, and charismatic. He had the vision, but not the capital. So, I gave it to him. I bought the company through a series of intermediaries, established a board of directors who answered only to me, and installed Marcus as CEO. He believed he had been headhunted by a mysterious, benevolent group of Swiss investors. He never once questioned it. He was too busy building his empire. My empire. I had kept my secret for his sake. I wanted him to feel that his success was his own, that he had earned it through his own merit. I loved him, and I believed his pride was a vital part of the man I had married. I was content to be his quiet partner, his support system, because I knew the truth. I knew that every award he won, every milestone the company celebrated, every paycheck that was issued was because of me. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I sank onto the velvet sofa in my study, the room where I conducted my real work. The walls were lined with first edition books, not on art, but on market theory and corporate law. On the desk sat a sleek encrypted laptop that connected me to my global network. I picked up the secure phone I used for all HT Capital business. My hand was steady now. The grief was hardening into something else, something cold and clear and sharp. Resolve. I dialed a number from memory. It rang once before it was answered. "Arthur," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's HT." Arthur Beck was the chairman of the board for HT Capital, a man in his 70s who had been my grandfather's most trusted advisor. He was the only person in the world, besides my lawyer, who knew my identity. "Harper," he said, his voice warm but instantly alert. "It's late. Is everything all right?" "No," I said simply. "I need you to do something for me. I want you to move up the annual leadership review for Apex Innovations." There was a brief pause. "Move it up?" he asked. "It's not scheduled for another 3 months. Is there a problem?" "A significant one," I replied, my gaze falling on a framed photo on the desk. It was of Marcus and me, taken 10 years ago on a trip to Italy. We were both smiling happy. He looked at me with such love in that picture, a love that was now either gone or had been a lie all along. "Schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp, at the main HT Capital building downtown." "The main building?" Arthur sounded surprised. The board meetings for subsidiary companies were never held there. That space was reserved for me. "Yes," I confirmed. "I want the entire executive leadership team present. That includes Marcus Thorne and the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, Isabel Laurent. Tell them the majority shareholder will be in attendance and wishes to address them personally." Another, longer pause. Arthur understood the gravity of what I was asking. In 15 years, I had never once attended a meeting. I had never revealed my face. My anonymity was the cornerstone of the entire operation. To break that protocol meant something monumental had happened. "It will be done," he said, his voice now grim. 8 a.m. Harper, are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. I ended the call and stood up, walking over to the large window that overlooked the city skyline. The lights of downtown twinkled, a testament to industry and ambition. One of those glittering towers belonged to Apex Innovations, to Marcus, and he had no idea that the woman he had dismissed as a nobody held its very foundations in the palm of her hand. They had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten who I was. And tomorrow morning, I was going to remind them. The early years of our marriage were a whirlwind of shared dreams and genuine partnership. We were a team. I had just finished my doctorate in art history, and Marcus was a junior executive with a ferocious work ethic, frustrated by the lack of vision in the company he worked for. We lived in a small apartment, poring over his business plans at our tiny kitchen table late into the night. I saw the spark in him, the raw, untamed ambition, and I believed in it completely. My inheritance had just come through, a fortune that felt abstract and overwhelming, and all I wanted was to use it to build a life with him. So I made him a proposition. I told him I'd received a modest inheritance and wanted to invest it. I encouraged him to leave his dead-end job and look for a company he could truly shape. It was then that I, through Arthur, found Apex Innovations, a small, floundering tech firm with a handful of brilliant patents but no leadership. It was the perfect vessel. I presented it to Marcus as an opportunity I'd heard about through a family friend. I watched him research it, his eyes lighting up with excitement. He saw what I saw. "This is it, Harper," he'd said, his voice thrumming with passion. "This company could change everything if I could just get in front of the investors." I made that happen. I funded the entire acquisition through HT Capital and arranged the interview. He was so nervous, pacing our living room for an hour before the meeting. I straightened his tie and kissed him for luck. "Just be yourself," I told him. "They'll see what I see." And they did, because I had instructed them to. He came home that night ecstatic, practically floating. "They're giving me full control. They want me as CEO." He'd lifted me up and spun me around the room, laughing with pure joy. That joy was real. His success in those early days felt like our success. I stepped back from my own academic career, convincing myself and everyone else that I was happier managing our home and supporting his demanding schedule. I poured all my energy into him, into Apex. I read every reap. RT analyzed every market trend. I was his silent, uncredited strategist. Over dinner, I'd casually drop suggestions, ideas I'd spent days researching. He'd absorb them and weeks later, present them at board meetings as his own brilliant insights. I never minded. His success was my project, my secret masterpiece. But as the years passed and the company grew into a corporate behemoth, something in Marcus shifted. The shared dream became his dream. Our success became his success. He started to see my quiet life not as a choice we made together, but as a reflection of my own lack of ambition. He stopped asking for my opinion on business matters. Our late-night talks were replaced by his monologues about his own genius. I became a fixture, a part of the elegant backdrop of his life, like the expensive art on our walls. I was the devoted wife, and he was the self-made man. A myth I had carefully constructed for him, which he had come to believe as gospel. Then, about 2 years ago, Isabelle Laurent joined the company. She was everything I was not: young, overtly ambitious, and utterly ruthless. She came from a background of new money and old insecurities, desperate to prove her worth in a world she felt she had to conquer. Her resume was impressive, but it was her sycophantic devotion to Marcus that secured her rapid ascent. She wasn't just his protégé. She was his reflection, a mirror that showed him the powerful, visionary leader he desperately wanted to be. I met her for the first time at a company picnic. She was charming on the surface, but her eyes had a cold, appraising quality. She looked at me not as the CEO's wife, but as an obstacle, an irrelevant relic from a bygone era. Her questions were always subtly undermining, couched in faux admiration. "It must be so relaxing to not have to worry about a career, Harper," she'd said once, with that razor-sharp smile. "I can't imagine it. My work is my life." She made it her mission to insert herself into every aspect of Marcus's professional world. She scheduled late-night meetings, volunteered for weekend projects, and became his indispensable right hand. Marcus was flattered by the attention. He saw her as a younger version of himself, and he nurtured her ambition, oblivious to the fact that it was aimed squarely at my position, not in the company, but in his life. She was building a narrative, piece by piece, that I was a weight holding him back. A simple, unintellectual woman who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of his world. The dinner last night was the culmination of her 2-year campaign. Her comment about me being a nobody wasn't a spontaneous insult. It was a strategic move, a public declaration of my irrelevance. She was testing the waters, checking to see if Marcus would defend me. And when he didn't, when he tacitly agreed with her assessment, she knew she had won. She had successfully severed the final thread of partnership between us in his mind. In that moment, I wasn't his wife. I was just an outdated accessory he had forgotten to replace. Her polished, disingenuous appearance, her vague yet impressive-sounding title, and her inappropriate, laser-focused interest in our life were all tools she had used to perfection. She hadn't just insulted me, she had orchestrated a coup, and my own husband had been her willing accomplice. Sleep was impossible. The hours after I left the gala were a long, silent vigil in my study. The anger and hurt churned within me, but beneath them, a new, cold clarity was taking root. The woman who had been content to live in the shadows was gone, burned away by the public humiliation. The woman who remained was HT, and she knew exactly what to do. The passive victim had left the ballroom. The strategist was now sitting in this chair, planning her countermove. My decision to call the emergency meeting was the first step. It was a declaration of war. But I knew I couldn't walk into that boardroom armed with only my identity. That would be dramatic, certainly, but it wouldn't be enough. Marcus was a formidable businessman, and Isabel was cunning. They would try to spin the narrative, to paint me as an emotional, scorned wife seeking revenge. I needed more than just the element of surprise. I needed irrefutable proof of their misconduct. I needed leverage. The clever trap, as my grandfather would have called it, was already built into the very structure of HT Capital. Every subsidiary, including Apex Innovations, was subject to a rigorous, unannounced internal audit once a year. The system was designed to ensure accountability and sniff out any hint of mismanagement. I had instructed Arthur to keep the process completely independent. Not even the CEOs knew the exact timing or focus of the audits. Coincidentally, the annual audit for Apex had been completed just 3 weeks ago. The final report was sitting in my secure digital vault, unread, until now. At 3 a.m., with a cup of strong black coffee at my side, I opened the encrypted file. My eyes scanned the executive summary, then dove into the granular details. For the first hour, everything seemed routine: impressive growth, solid profit margins, the picture of a well-run company. Marcus, for all his personal failings, was indeed a talented CEO. But I wasn't looking at the big picture. I was looking for the small cracks, the tiny inconsistencies that people like Isabel Laurent always leave behind. And then I found it. It was buried deep in the expense reports for the Strategic Partnerships Division, a department Isabel had created and now ran with an iron fist. Her travel and entertainment budget was astronomical, nearly triple that of any other department head. I started cross-referencing the dates of her expenses with her official company calendar. A week-long investor summit in Zurich corresponded with a major international film festival. A tech conference in Monaco was held on a yacht, with receipts from a Michelin-starred restaurant that totaled more than a junior employee's monthly salary. A 3-day client meeting in the Caribbean had no client names attached, only receipts from a luxury spa and a high-end boutique. It was a clear, brazen pattern of abuse. She was using the company coffers as her personal slush fund. But the most damning part was the signature at the bottom of every single approval form: Marcus Thorne. He had signed off on all of it without question. Whether it was willful complicity or gross negligence, it didn't matter. He was responsible. He had allowed his ambitious vice president to defraud the company he was entrusted to lead. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I forwarded the entire audit report, with the relevant sections highlighted, to Arthur Beck's secure email address. My instructions were simple: have our legal team review this immediately. I want a full summary of potential charges and corporate liabilities on my desk by 7 a.m. Next, I turned my attention to Isabel herself. A person with this level of arrogance and disregard for rules rarely starts from scratch. There had to be a history. I engaged a discreet, highly effective private investigator I had used in the past for vetting potential acquisitions. My request was urgent and precise: a complete background check on Isabel Laurent, focusing on her employment history and any past litigation. I told him I needed everything he could find before sunrise. The turning point had come. The shock and pain had been the catalyst, but this quiet, methodical investigation was the response. I was no longer just the wronged wife. I was the owner of a multi-billion-dollar company protecting her assets from a corrupt employee and a negligent CEO. I was using the very skills I had hidden for decades, the acumen my grandfather had instilled in me, to dismantle the false reality they had built. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep into my study, my secure phone buzzed. It was the investigator. "You were right to be suspicious," he said, his voice gravelly with lack of sleep. Our Miss Laurent has a history. She was let go from her previous 2 positions for financial improprieties. Both companies settled out of court with strict non-disclosure agreements to avoid a scandal. She's a professional predator, and it looks like she found her biggest score yet. I hung up the phone, a grim satisfaction settling over me. I had everything I needed. The trap was set. The evidence was compiled. All that was left was for the targets to walk into the boardroom and face the nobody they had created. The HT Capitol building was an imposing monolith of black glass and steel, a silent testament to power and discretion. At precisely 7:55 a.m., I watched on a security feed from the boardroom as Marcus and Isabelle stepped out of the elevator. Marcus looked irritated and confused, straightening his tie as if preparing for a battle he didn't understand. Isabelle, however, looked energized, her expression a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. She likely saw this mysterious summons as an opportunity, another chance to shine in front of the high command. They were escorted into the boardroom by Arthur, whose face was a perfect mask of polite neutrality. The room was vast and intimidating by design. A single, colossal mahogany table stretched nearly its entire length, surrounded by 24 empty leather chairs. At the far end, against a panoramic window that offered a godlike view of the city, was one more chair. My chair. I waited until they were seated before I made my entrance from a private side door. I had chosen my outfit with care. A simple but impeccably tailored dark gray suit, my hair pulled back in a severe chignon. I wore no jewelry except for my wedding ring. I wanted them to see Harper Thorne, the woman they knew before they met HT, the woman they didn't. The moment I walked in, both their heads snapped in my diarch. Tian, Marcus's face flooded with confusion. Harper, what on earth are you doing here? This is a closed board meeting. Isabelle just stared, a slow, contemptuous smirk spreading across her lips. Lost, dear? She asked, her voice dripping with condescension. The spouse's lounge is on the 2nd floor. I ignored them both and walked calmly to the head of the table, placing my leather portfolio down in front of me. I turned to Arthur, who stood by the door. Arthur, please ensure we are not disturbed. Of course, Madam Chairman, he said, his voice resonating with formal respect. He gave a slight bow and closed the doors, leaving the 3 of us in a heavy, echoing silence. The title hung in the air, Madam Chairman. Marcus's confusion morphed into sheer disbelief. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to clear water from his ears. Madam Chairman? Arthur, what is this? What is my wife doing here? Isabelle's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. I sat down and looked directly at Marcus. Your wife, I said, my voice even and cold, is here because she called this meeting. Your wife is here because this is her boardroom. I let the words sink in, watching the color drain from his face. HT Capital, I continued, gesturing around the opulent room. The HT stands for Harper Thorne. I founded this company 26 years ago. I acquired Apex Innovations 15 years ago, and I appointed you its CEO. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus looked as if he had been physically struck. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Isabelle's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The world she had so carefully constructed, the hierarchy she was so desperate to climb, had just been inverted in the most spectacular fashion. Finally, Marcus found his voice. It was a hoarse whisper. No, that's impossible. The investors, they're in Zurich. The investors in Zurich is a fiction I created to protect your ego, Marcus, I said, my voice hardening. I wanted you to believe you had earned this all on your own. I thought it was important. Clearly, I was mistaken. Isabelle, recovering first, leaped to the offensive. It was her only move. This is absurd. She's lying. Marcus, she's clearly having some sort of breakdown. This is a pathetic attempt to get attention. Is it? I asked calmly. I opened my portfolio and slid a single document across the polished table toward her. It was the incorporation paper for HT Capital, with my signature clearly visible at the bottom. Her eyes darted down to the paper, then back up to my face. The panic was beginning to set in. This doesn't prove anything. This is a trick," she snarled, her voice rising in pitch. "You're a vengeful, bored housewife trying to ruin a great man." "Am I?" I turned my attention to her fully now. "Let's talk about your contributions to the company, shall we, Miss Laurent? Let's talk about your expense reports." I projected the audit summary onto the large screen behind me. A detailed list of her fraudulent expenses filled the screen. The investor summit in Zurich, the tech conference in Monaco, the client meeting in the Caribbean. I had highlighted every lavish personal purchase she had disguised as a business expense. "You have, in the last fiscal year alone, defrauded this company of over $200,000, I stated, my voice ringing with authority. "You used company funds for luxury vacations, designer clothing, and spa treatments, all while claiming to be working for the benefit of the shareholders. The primary shareholder, I might add." Isabel's face went white. The poorly executed threats began immediately. "You can't prove any of that. Those were all legitimate business trips. I'll sue you for slander. I'll sue this entire company." Her lashing out, her obvious, frantic lies, only served to confirm her guilt. She looked at Marcus, her eyes pleading. "Marcus, tell her how crucial those trips were for building our partner network." But Marcus wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the screen, at the damning evidence, at his own signature visible on the digital approval forms at the bottom of each page. The reality of his own negligence, of his own foolishness, was crashing down on him. He had been played, and in doing so, he had betrayed the very person who had given him everything. The powerful CEO was gone. In his place was just a man, small and broken, finally understanding the true cost of his choices. The immediate aftermath of the reveal was chaotic. Isabel, cornered and exposed, doubled down on her belligerent defense. "This is a witch hunt," she yelled, her voice echoing in the cavernous boardroom. "This is what happens when you let an emotional, unqualified woman near a balance sheet. She doesn't understand how business at this level works. You have to spend money to make money." She turned to Marcus, her tone shifting from outrage to a desperate appeal. "Marcus, you know the value I bring. You know this is all just a misunderstanding. Tell her." Marcus, however, was a statue. He sat staring at the screen, his face ashen. The evidence of his own complicity, displayed in stark black and white, had shattered his carefully constructed world. He had been so blinded by Isabel's flattery and ambition, so wrapped up in the myth of his own genius, that he had failed in his most basic duty as a leader. He had enabled her, and in doing so, had put the entire company, my company, at risk. "Isabel," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, "just be quiet." Her face crumpled in disbelief. "What? You're taking her side?" "It's my signature on those forms," he said, his gaze fixed on the screen. "It's my responsibility." I let the weight of his admission settle in the room before I continued. This was no longer just about public humiliation or a broken marriage. This was about corporate malfeasance. "Your misunderstanding, Miss Laurent," I said, my voice cutting through the tension, "is also known as wire fraud, and your value to this company has just become a significant liability." I gestured to Arthur, who stepped forward and placed another file on the table. "While you were building your partner network on company-funded vacations," I continued, "I took the liberty of looking into your professional history. It turns out you have a pattern of this kind of behavior." I projected the investigator's report onto the screen. It detailed her 2 previous jobs and the quiet, out-of-court settlements for financial improprieties. I then brought up the final, irrefutable piece of evidence, a sworn affidavit from the CFO of her last company, a man my legal team had contacted just this morning. Despising the NDA that had silenced him for years, he was more than willing to provide a statement detailing Isabel's exact methods of embezzlement. "It seems you are very good at what you do, Miss Laurent," I said calmly. "You find a powerful, preferably arrogant, male executive. You flatter him, make yourself indispensable, and then you begin to bleed the company dry, all under his nose and with his signature of approval. It's a clever model, but your time running that model at my company is over. Isabel stared at the affidavit, her face a mixture of fury and terror. The spell was broken. There was no room left for lies or manipulation. The proof was absolute. She looked at Marcus one last time, searching for an ally, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. He had finally seen her for what she was, a predator who had used his ego as a key to the vault. This was the second, more powerful confrontation. The first reveal had been about my identity. This one was about their crimes. And it was this one that finally severed the toxic loyalty that had bound Marcus to her. He slowly turned his chair to face me, the full weight of his betrayal, of me, of his position, of his own integrity, visible in his eyes. "Harper, I didn't know," he stammered. "No," I replied, my voice softening almost imperceptibly, not with pity but with a sad finality. "You didn't, but you should have. You were the CEO. It was your job to know. You were so busy listening to the person telling you what you wanted to hear that you failed to see what was right in front of you." I paused, letting the truth of that statement land. "And you were so busy building your own legacy that you forgot who laid the foundation." The fight went out of Isabel completely. She sank back into her chair, defeated. The escalating stakes had moved beyond personal drama into the cold, hard reality of legal consequences. The case wasn't just built, it was airtight. And they were both caught in the middle of it. The ambitious vice president and the negligent CEO, stripped of their power and prestige, finally forced to face the quiet nobody who held both of their futures in her hands. I let the silence stretch, allowing the full scope of their predicament to dawn on them. Isabel was finished, her career a smoking crater. Marcus was broken, his entire professional identity revealed as a house of cards built on a foundation he never knew existed. The climax of this drama wasn't going to be a shouting match. It would be a quiet, systematic execution of consequences. "Arthur," I said, turning toward the door, "please send in Mr. Davies." The door opened, and a sharp-featured man in a severe suit entered, carrying a briefcase. He was Daniel Davies, the head of HT Capital's formidable legal department. He nodded respectfully to me and then took a seat at the table, opening his briefcase with an ominous click. "Miss Laurent," I began, my tone formal and detached. "You are being terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct and felony theft. Mr. Davies has a severance agreement for you. It's quite simple. You will sign a full confession of your actions, return every dollar you stole, and agree to a permanent non-disclosure agreement regarding your time at Apex Innovations and your knowledge of HT Capital's structure. In exchange, we will not press criminal charges." Isabel stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. She knew it was a generous offer, a chance to avoid prison. She snatched the pen from Mr. Davies and signed the documents without reading them, her movements sharp and angry. She stood up, shoved the chair back, and walked toward the door. Before she left, she turned to look at me one last time. "You played the long game," she said, her voice a low hiss. "I'll give you that." "I didn't play a game," I corrected her quietly. "I built a business. You tried to rob it. There's a difference." She said nothing more, just turned and walked out, a security guard already waiting in the hallway to escort her from the building. The door clicked shut, leaving just me, Marcus, and the lawyer in the room. Now it was Marcus's turn. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "Harper, what happens to me?" This was the moment. The public showdown was over. This was the private one. The resolution of 25 years of secrets and betrayals. I looked at the man I had loved, the man I had built this empire for, and felt not anger, but a profound and weary sadness. "Your position as CEO of Apex Innovations is no longer tenable, Marcus," I said softly. "Your negligence has exposed this company to significant risk. You allowed a predator to operate freely under your command. You failed in your fiduciary duty." He flinched as if I had slapped him. "So you're firing me after everything I built?" "What we built," I corrected him gently. "And I'm not firing you, I'm accepting your resignation." Mr. Davies slid another set of documents across the table. "This is a resignation and transition agreement, Mr. Thorne," the lawyer said. "It outlines a 6-month period where you will serve as a consultant to assist the new leadership team. You will retain a portion of your stock options, vested over time, contingent on your full cooperation. It is a more than generous arrangement under the circumstances." Marcus stared at the papers, his hands trembling. This was it, the end of his reign, the public humiliation of stepping down from the company he considered his own. He looked up at me, his face a canvas of despair. "Harper, please, we can fix this. I can fix this. I'm sorry, for everything. For what I let her say, for what I didn't see, I was a fool." His apology, finally, sounded genuine. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability. For a fleeting second, the memory of the young man I fell in love with flickered in my mind. But it wasn't enough. The trust had been irrevocably broken. This was the final, powerful moment of realization. Not just for him, but for me. The decision I made next would define the rest of my life. I could take him back, try to rebuild from the ashes, or I could finally, fully, step into my own power. I stood up and walked to the panoramic window, looking out over the city. City, my empire. "The business arrangements are on the table, Marcus," I said, my back still to him. "That's a decision for you and the lawyers to finalize." I turned to face him. "As for us, as for our marriage, I think we both know that's over. You didn't just disrespect me last night, Marcus. You erased me, and I'm done being invisible." His face crumbled. He finally understood. He had lost everything, not just his company, but his wife. He picked up the pen with a defeated sigh and signed the papers. His triumphant action wasn't a defiant shout. It was a quiet signature of surrender, the final acknowledgement of the truth he had ignored for so long. He had broken free from Isabel's spell, but in doing so, he had lost himself. The aftermath was swift and decisive. With Marcus's resignation signed and Isabel's confession secured, I moved quickly to stabilize Apex Innovations. I appointed an interim CEO from within HT Capital's trusted leadership circle, a brilliant woman named Evelyn Reed, who had been managing my European portfolio for years. The official press release stated that Marcus Thorne was stepping down for personal reasons and would be taking on a transitional advisory role. The corporate world buzzed with speculation, but the truth remained safely behind the walls of my boardroom. Isabel Laurent, true to her nature, vanished. The last I heard, she had moved to a different country, attempting to start over, but the stain of her actions followed her. My legal team made sure that her name was quietly but effectively blacklisted in the upper echelons of the corporate world. There would be no more companies for her to prey on. She faced financial ruin and social exile, a fitting downfall for a woman who valued status above all else. Justice, in her case, was not a gavel strike in a courtroom, but a slow, silent eraser. From the world she so desperately wanted to conquer. Marcus, for his part, fulfilled his duties as a consultant with a humbled, quiet diligence. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by a deep, weary regret. We met a few times in the presence of our lawyers to begin the divorce proceedings. The conversations were stilted and sad. He apologized again, more profoundly this time. "I took you for granted, Harper," he said during our last meeting, his eyes filled with a sorrow I knew was genuine. "I got so caught up in the applause, I forgot who wrote the music. I am so sorry." "I know, Marcus," I said, and I meant it. I accepted his apology not for him, but for me. It was the final step in closing that chapter of my life. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving him, it was about releasing myself from the weight of his betrayal. We divided our assets amicably. He didn't fight for a share of HT Capital, he knew he had no claim to it. He walked away a wealthy man, but a broken one, stripped of the identity he had spent his life building. With the divorce finalized and Apex stable under new leadership, I stepped fully into my role as chairman of HT Capital. I moved out of the grand, empty house we had shared and into a penthouse apartment overlooking the park. I started attending board meetings, not as a remote, anonymous voice, but as Harper Thorne, the woman in charge. It was terrifying and exhilarating. The quiet, background life I had led for so long was over. I was finally visible. My health improved dramatically. With the primary source of stress removed from my life, my body began to heal. The fatigue lifted, replaced by a new energy, a new sense of purpose. I poured myself into my work, not just the financial side, but the philanthropic arms of my foundation, using my resources to support the arts and education, the little hobbies Isabel had once mocked. 6 months after that fateful night, I was hosting a fundraiser for a new wing at the city's art museum. It was a project I had personally championed. As I stood at the podium, addressing the crowd of donors and city officials, I saw a few of the Apex board members in the audience. They looked at me with a newfound respect, a deep and abiding awe. I was no longer just the CEO's wife. I was the woman who signed their paychecks, the architect of their success. After my speech, Arthur came to my side, a warm smile on his face. "Your grandfather would have been incredibly proud of you tonight, Harper," he said. I smiled back, a genuine, peaceful smile. I think, for the first time, I'm proud of myself. The conflicts were resolved. The antagonists had faced their downfall. The reconciliation was not with a loved one, but with myself, with the powerful, capable woman I had kept hidden for far too long. Standing there, surrounded by the art I loved and the legacy I had built, I felt a sense of peace and vindication that was worth more than any company or fortune. I was not a reflection of anyone else's success. I was the source, and I was finally free.